Imagine winning an election by, well, an absolute landslide in the national parliament.
Right, claiming a full mandate to reshape the country.
Exactly. But while simultaneously losing the public vote by nearly 1 million ballots.
It sounds completely impossible.
It does, but today is Wednesday, June 17th, 2026, and the democratic counting machine in Scotland is essentially broken.
Completely fractured.
We're looking at a system that just delivered an SNP and Scottish Green Party alliance, a dominant 73-seat working majority. And that's despite the raw data showing a really comprehensive, crushing defeat in the actual volume of public votes cast.
Yeah, it is a profound paradox. And I mean, before we dive into the exact mechanics of how a government secures a majority while mathematically losing an election, we should probably make a quick note on how we're approaching this today.
Good idea.
Yeah.
The stack of sources we're pulling from for this deep dive is, well, it's incredibly charged.
Very much so. We are looking at raw post-election data from the Electoral Commission, structural critiques from the Electoral Reform Society, or ERS, alongside this really deep demographic analysis from the IPPR.
Right, the Institute for Public Policy Research. We also have data from SPICE, which is the Scottish Parliament Information Centre.
Yeah, essentially the Parliament's internal neutral data wing. Plus, we're tracking the live blog from the Diffley Partnership. And the analysis across these reports, I mean, it spans from intense left-wing critiques of government failure all the way to the mechanics of right-wing populist surges.
So it's heavily politicized material.
Exactly. And our goal here today isn't to take a side, or validate any specific political ideology. We're not here to champion the anger on either the left or the right. We're acting strictly as analysts for you, the listener.
We're just holding up a mirror to the facts.
Right, a mirror to the math, the structural realities on the ground, and that sheer volatility simmering beneath the official seat counts. We are just following the numbers.
And boy, those numbers tell a story of systemic betrayal. Because to understand the fractured, highly volatile reality of what just happened in this May 2026 Holyrood election, we actually have to rewind the clock a bit.
Yeah, you really can't look at 2026 in a vacuum.
No, not at all. We have to look back at how the Scottish electorate weaponized their votes 2 years prior. I mean, we need to talk about the 2024 UK general election.
That is exactly where the narrative of this current crisis begins. Because in 2024, we witnessed this massive, deliberate shift in voter behavior in Scotland.
It was seismic.
It really was. For the better part of 2 decades, the Scottish National Party had been just an unstoppable electoral juggernaut. But by 2024, the public mood had shifted from enthusiasm to just profound exhaustion.
Right. The electorate was frustrated with Holyrood's record on public services, the stagnation of the domestic economy, and the completely stalled constitutional question regarding independence.
Yeah, and the voters who were exhausted, they weren't just the staunch unionists who always opposed the SNP anyway.
That's the key point, right?
Exactly. The data shows that a really significant chunk of the pro-independence base was equally exhausted. And that exhaustion led to something highly strategic.
They loaned their votes.
Yes. Scottish voters, including those exhausted but still fundamentally pro-independent supporters, deliberately loaned their votes to the Labour Party. You really have to understand the psychology here.
It wasn't a sudden love for Labour.
No, not a sudden, deep-seated ideological conversion to the unionist labor cause. It was a tactical transactional strike. It was a weaponized vote designed specifically to punish the SNP establishment and break their monopoly on Scottish representation in Westminster.
They essentially said, you've taken our support for granted, so we're taking it away.
And it was brutally effective. I mean, the SNP was utterly routed in 2024. They were reduced to just 9 seats in the UK Parliament.
Just 9 seats. I mean, it was a tactical loan with very strict, albeit unspoken, conditions. The public handed Labour the keys to Westminster, effectively saying, we'll give you the power to govern, but you have to deliver material improvement. But, when we look at the period between that 2024 general election and our current moment after May 2026, the rapid deterioration of that loan support is just breathtaking.
It really is. The sources we're analyzing describe Keir Starmer's administration in London during this 2-year window in frankly devastating terms.
Yeah, some political analysts characterize the Downing Street operation as being run by, quote, incompetent charlatans.
The collapse in public trust was precipitous. That transactional conditional support that Labour enjoyed in Scotland completely evaporated.
Because voters reacted to a series of UK-wide policies and missteps.
Exactly. Broken promises that made them feel entirely alienated. Labour almost overnight transitioned from being this shiny vehicle for protest to being viewed as just an entrenched part of the systemic problem.
And that collapse in trust culminated in one specific, just incredible moment that we need to dissect, February 9th, 2026.
Oh, the Glasgow press conference.
Yes. Picture this, Anna Sarwar, the leader of Scottish Labour, steps up to a podium in Glasgow for a hastily arranged press conference. And he doesn't just offer a mild critique of his boss in London.
No, he publicly and forcefully demands that Prime Minister Keir Starmer resign.
I mean, it was an unprecedented structural fracture within a major UK political party.
Sarwar stood there and stated unequivocally that the distraction needs to end and the leadership in Downing Street has to change.
He tried to soften the blow slightly, right?
Eagerly. He called Starmer a decent man, but he explicitly said his primary loyalty was to Scotland. And he basically said that Starmer's ongoing presence was actively sabotaging the party's future north of the border.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. You're telling me that the leader of Scottish Labour orchestrated a highly public mutiny against his own sitting prime minister.
Just 3 months before a critical Holyrood election, yes.
That sounds like absolute political suicide. Why on earth would he detonate a bomb inside his own party that close to polling day?
Well, because he saw an even bigger bomb heading straight for him if he didn't. You have to look at the context of that February mutiny. The sources point directly to the fallout from Downing Street's appointment of Peter Mandelson as the British ambassador to the United States.
Ah, the Mandelson scandal.
Right. That appointment came under intense, brutal international scrutiny due to Mandelson's historical ties to the disgraced financier and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
It became a complete media firestorm that swallowed the government whole.
Exactly. And following that scandal, the internal mechanics of Downing Street just collapsed. Starmer's powerful chief of staff, Morgan McSweeney, and his director of communications, Tim Allen, both resigned in the fallout.
So the Westminster operation was in undeniable meltdown.
Absolute meltdown. So Sarwar is sitting in Glasgow, looking at the polling data for the upcoming May election, and realizing that the lone voters from 2024 are watching the government they just elected implode in scandal.
So he was forced to attempt an amputation.
Precisely. He saw the electoral cliff approaching rapidly. His only strategic play was to try and sever the Scottish Labour Party from the toxicity of the Westminster leadership.
Hoping the Scottish public would view them as a distinct, separate entity.
That was the gamble, yeah.
But, I mean, if Scottish voters originally lent their support to Labour specifically to send a message of competence and change, and the alternative they empowered immediately implodes in scandal and infighting, where does that orphaned vote go?
It's a great question.
How does an electorate react when their tactical protest vote ends up feeling like just another betrayal?
Well, it destroys the concept of transactional trust entirely. When you use your democratic voice to protest a failing incumbent government and the alternative you elect immediately collapses into incompetence, you are left feeling entirely unrepresented.
You feel politically homeless.
Exactly. Scottish voters looked around the political landscape in the early spring of 2026 and saw absolutely no viable home for their vote.
Because they couldn't exactly flock to the Conservatives either, right?
No, the Tories were completely toxic and a spent force in Scotland by 2026. We know from the final tally in May that they ended up losing 19 seats, crashing down to a historical low.
And the Lib Dems.
While they did make some marginal gains, primarily in specific, highly localized constituencies like the Highlands and Islands, they simply weren't viewed by the broader national public as a serious government in waiting.
So you have a profound structural disillusionment setting in.
The electorate was deeply cynical. They felt betrayed by the SNP's domestic record, betrayed by Labour's Westminster chaos, and just entirely uninterested in the Conservatives.
That incredibly toxic mixture of anger, exhaustion, and political homelessness is the exact cocktail that set the stage for the chaotic, fractured reality of the May 2026 Holyrood vote.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of what happened on May 7th.
Right, because that lone vote from 2024 collapsed, and the traditional options felt hollow. The 2026 electorate fractured in a way that triggered a massive, glaring mathematical anomaly in the Scottish electoral system.
A huge anomaly.
Let's run through the headline numbers. The SNP secured 58 seats, making them the largest party, though shrinking. Labour tied with Reform UK at 17 seats apiece.
A huge shock there.
Yeah. The Greens took 15, the Tories 12, and the Lib Dems 10. But to understand why these headline numbers represent a total failure of the system, we can't just read the scoreboard.
No, we really have to explain how the Scottish Parliament voting system actually works.
Right, it's called the Additional Member System, or AMS. And we are told this system is meant to be the great equalizer, the ultimate shock absorber of Scottish democracy.
The intention behind AMS, designed at the dawn of devolution in 1999, was specifically to prevent the exact scenario we just witnessed. The architects looked at Westminster and saw that first past the post often creates wildly disproportionate outcomes.
Like where a party can win 40% of the vote, but take 60% of the power.
Exactly. They wanted Holyrood to be different. They wanted a parliament that mathematically mirrored the true will of the public, so they created a dual ballot system.
Let's walk the listener through this. You walk into the polling booth, and you are handed two pieces of paper.
Correct. The first piece of paper is your constituency vote. This is a traditional first-past-the-post ballot, identical to how you vote in a UK general election. You're voting for a specific local candidate.
And there are 73 of these local constituencies across Scotland.
Right. The person with the most votes in that specific geographical area wins the seat. Simple, winner takes all.
But because winner takes all can leave huge swaths of the public unrepresented if their candidate comes in second, you get a second piece of paper, the regional list ballot.
Often printed on peach paper, yes. The peach ballot is the corrective mechanism. On this paper, you aren't voting for a person, you are voting for a political party.
And there are 56 of these regional list seats divided across 8 large regions.
Yes, and these seats are allocated using a complex mathematical formula called the Delant method.
Okay, I want to create an aha moment for our listeners here because people hear Delant method and their eyes just glaze over.
It sounds incredibly dry.
It does, but it is the entire key to understanding the betrayal of 2026. Walk us through a micro-simulation of how this math is actually supposed to work.
Let's do it. Imagine a localized Scottish region with exactly 100 voters. In the local first-past-the-post constituency race, 40 people vote for the SNP candidate.
Okay, 40 for the SNP.
The remaining 60 people are completely opposed to the SNP, but their votes are fractured. 20 vote Labour, 20 vote Conservative, and 20 vote Reform.
So under first past the post, the SNP candidate wins the seat with just 40 votes, even though 60 people, the clear majority, voted against them.
Precisely. That is the fundamental flaw of first past the post. But now, those same 100 people cast their second vote, their regional list vote, on the peach ballot.
And this is where Dulcon kicks in.
Exactly. The D'Hondt formula looks at the results of the peach ballot and says, okay, the SNP just won the local seat. We need to penalize them on the regional list to allow the opposition parties to catch up.
How does it penalize them?
Through division. The formula takes the total number of peach ballot votes a party receives and divides it by the number of constituency seats they have already won, +1.
Wait, so if the SNP gets 40 list votes, but they already won the local seat, their list vote total is divided by 2.
Exactly. Their 40 votes are suddenly treated as 20 votes. This drops them down the ranking, allowing Labour or the Tories or the Greens to win the regional seats.
So the ultimate goal of the D'Hondt method is that when you add the 73 local seats and the 56 regional seats together, the final 129-seat parliament broadly matches how the public voted on that peach regional ballot.
It is designed to ensure no single party can dominate the chamber without genuine proportional public support.
It's meant to be an elegant mathematical shock absorber. But according to the deep structural critique from the Electoral Reform Society, the ERS, in the May 2026 election, that shock absorber completely blew out.
It utterly failed.
The suspension collapsed. The ERS concludes that this election produced the single most disproportional result in the entire history of the Scottish Parliament.
The ERS data here is incredibly damning, and we really have to look closely at their metrics. Political scientists measure proportionality using something called the deviation from vote score, or the DV score.
Which is a pretty simple concept, right?
Yeah, you just compare the percentage of seats a party holds in the parliament to the percentage of the popular vote they actually won. The difference between those two numbers is the deviation.
So the lower the DV score, the closer the parliament matches the public's actual...
Correct. Across the first 6 Holyrood elections since 1999, the historical average DV score was 10.7.
A relatively healthy proportional democracy. But what was the DV score for the 2026 election?
It skyrocketed to 17.8. The ERS found that the SNP was overrepresented in the parliament by 17.8 percentage points compared to their actual popular support on the regional list.
Wow.
For the first time in the history of devolution, a single political party secured an overall seat share that was vastly, significantly larger than their list vote share.
But here's where it gets really interesting. If the dot method is specifically designed to mathematically crush a party on the regional list if they win too many local seats, how did the SNP bypass the math?
It all comes down to the constituency map.
How does a deviation of 17.8 actually happen in the real world? Let's look at that map. The SNP won 57 out of the 73 first-past-the-post local seats. They absolutely dominated the geography of Scotland.
They did.
But here's the crazy part in the data. They won those 57 local seats despite their actual share of the constituency vote dropping about 9.5 percentage points from the last election.
Right. They bled almost a tenth of their local support, yet they kept nearly all the local power.
Did the system actually protect the establishment from the voters?
It did, and this is where the fractured reality of the opposition becomes the government's greatest asset. The SNP survived, and structurally thrived, solely because the opposition vote was heavily split.
Just like in our micro-simulation.
Exactly. In towns and cities across the country, you had a clear majority of people voting vehemently against the SNP. But because of the collapse of labor and the rise of reform, those anti-government votes were split 3 or sometimes 4 ways.
Between labor, reform, the Conservatives, and the Lib Dems. So the SNP candidate slips right through the middle. They win the seat with perhaps 35 or 38% of the vote, while over 60% of the local area voted for someone else to represent them.
Precisely. And then we get to the regional list, where the system is supposed to correct this. But it didn't.
Because of a deliberate, calculated strategy.
Yes. The regional list system, combined with a highly fragmented opposition in the constituencies, allowed the SNP and the Scottish Greens to act as a tag team and artificially claim a structural majority.
It's like entering a tag team wrestling match, but convincing the referee that you are two independent solo fighters.
That is the perfect analogy.
The SNP takes all the hits in the ring, soaking up the local constituency wins on thin margins, and then the Greens stand on the ropes, explicitly campaigning to harvest the regional list votes.
The Greens explicitly told pro-independence voters, do not waste your peach list vote on the SNP.
Because the Dion formula will mathematically punish them.
Right, because they are winning the local seats. So they said, give your list vote to us instead. We haven't won any local seats, so our list votes won't be divided.
It's a massive systemic loophole.
2 separate political parties who govern together as a single executive bloc, intentionally gaming the 2-ballot system to bypass the proportional intent of the Scottish Parliament.
It allowed them to build an impenetrable wall of 73 combined seats that fundamentally, mathematically, did not reflect the will of the Scottish public.
Which brings us to the core thesis of this deep dive. Having established that the seat count is a structural illusion born of a split opposition, we now have to strip away the complex formulas.
Right, we need to strip away the constituency boundaries, the tactical games, and the political rhetoric. We need to dive into the raw, indisputable, physical mathematics of the ballot cast.
Because when you just count the pieces of paper dropped into boxes by human beings, the entire narrative of this election completely flips.
This is the myth of the mandate?
Yeah.
This is the anti-government majority?
It is the most vital data point of the entire 2026 cycle. When you isolate the raw popular vote, the claim that this government holds a democratic mandate collapses completely under its own weight.
So I am going to lay out the exact data point that you, the listener, absolutely must know. This is the combined ballot math across the 4,601,838 total processed ballots in this election.
Let's hear it.
Let's look at the government alliance first. If you take every single vote cast for the Scottish National Party and every single vote cast for the Scottish Greens across both the local and regional ballots, their combined total is 1,877,518 votes.
That number, 1.87 million, represents the absolute maximum ceiling of active public support for the governing executive. That is every single person who actively endorsed their agenda.
Now let's look at the opposition bloc. If you combine the total votes for the Labour Party, Reform UK, the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, and all the others, every single ballot cast for a party outside the governing alliance.
What's the total?
That total is 2,724,330 votes.
The contrast is just staggering. When you subtract the government alliance's total votes from the opposition's total votes, you are left with a massive, undeniable deficit of 846,812.
There were nearly 850,000 more votes cast against the SNP and Green framework than for it. That is not a narrow margin.
No, not at all.
That is not a statistical anomaly or a slight polling error. That is a landslide of public opposition.
It is a massive deficit that fundamentally challenges the legitimacy of the executive. And, it's vital to look closely at who makes up that opposition bloc.
Right, because it's easy for an entrenched political establishment to dismiss opposition numbers.
Exactly. They say, well, the opposition total includes right-wing populists like Reform, or it includes the toxic Tories, so we can morally discount them from the public discourse.
But look at the others factor in the data you just read. Of that 2.7 million strong opposition bloc, 148,496 votes went to independent candidates and tiny alternative micro-parties.
That is incredible. Nearly 150,000 Scottish citizens walked into a voting booth, looked at the multi-million-pound machinery of the SNP, Labour, and the Tories, and instead voted for candidates with no money and no media backing.
Candidates with almost zero mathematical chance of actually winning a seat, just to register their dissent.
It completely invalidates the excuse that the opposition is just a collection of standard political rivals. It proves that a massive chunk of the electorate was desperately actively searching for alternatives outside the establishment structure.
They were trying to find any lever they could physically pull to say no to the current executive.
Absolutely.
So, circling back to you, the listener, why does this matter? Why should you care about the minutia of ballot math in this 850,000 vote deficit?
Because a mandate is not just a political buzzword.
Exactly. It is the foundational mechanism of your daily life. When a government sits in Holyrood and they pass laws that dictate your income tax rates, they dictate the staffing for your local hospital, they dictate the curriculum taught in your child's school.
And they do all of that claiming they have a mandate from the Scottish people.
But mathematically, they lost the public vote by almost 1 million ballots. It creates a profound systemic crisis of democratic legitimacy.
A mandate fundamentally implies consent. It implies that the broad will of the population is behind your legislative agenda. The physical math of the 2026 election definitively proves that the broad will of the Scottish people was actively, loudly opposed to their agenda.
They're governing society based on the technicality of a three-way opposition split and a loophole in the AMS system.
Not on the consent of the governed.
And if the electoral math was already balanced on a razor's edge due to this split opposition, we have to ask a massive hypothetical question based on the timeline of events.
The judicial timeline.
Yes. What would have happened if the electorate had known the full, unvarnished truth about the governing party's internal finances before they walked into the polling booths? We have to talk about the judicial shield. We have to talk about the Peter Murrell embezzlement scandal.
This is perhaps the most explosive and heavily scrutinized element of the entire 2026 electoral timeline. On May 25th, 2026, just over 2 weeks after the election results were finalized.
2 weeks after John Swinney had safely secured his return as First Minister.
Right. A massive bombshell dropped in the Scottish judicial system. Peter Murrell, the former long-standing chief executive of the SNP and the husband of former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, stood in court and formally pled guilty to embezzlement.
He pled guilty to embezzling over £400,000 of funds.
Yes. And crucially, we have to look at the source of that money. This wasn't dark money from a corporate mega-donor or union backing.
These were funds raised directly from ordinary grassroots party members.
It was money explicitly crowdfunded and donated for an independence referendum campaign that never materialized.
The timing is what the political analysts and our source documents focus on intensely. The judicial process, the trial, and the ultimate guilty plea acted as an absolute shield for the political establishment.
Let's look back at the core vote we discussed earlier. The SNP won 57 constituency seats with exactly 877,077 local votes.
That is their die-hard base.
Those are the loyalists who stuck with the party despite the labor surge in 2024, despite the crumbling public services, and despite the exhaustion. It is the loyalist wall.
The bedrock of their electoral survival.
But loyalty in politics has limits, especially when it involves direct, undeniable financial betrayal. The analysis suggests that had this guilty plea dominated the front pages in March or April, right, in the absolute heat of the election campaign, the psychological impact would have been devastating.
Imagine being a grassroots activist in a working-class neighborhood. You donated 10 or 20 pounds from a very tight household budget for a cause you deeply believe in.
And then you see undeniable court-proven evidence that the chief architect of the party systematically stole it. It changes the entire narrative of the election.
The SNP's core messaging has always been Westminster is holding Scotland back. But if that guilty plea happens in April, The narrative instantly becomes our own leadership robbed us.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for those 57 constituency seats the SNP won? We know they won many on razor-thin margins against a split opposition. What does the data suggest happens if even 3% of that core loyalist vote stays home?
What's fascinating and frankly terrifying for the SNP strategists is how fragile that 57-seat wall actually was. Extrapolating from the source data, if you apply a mere 3 to 5% drop in the SNP's constituency vote due to a suppressed turnout from disillusioned loyalists,
What happens?
it triggers a catastrophic nationwide domino effect.
Walk me through that. Why does just 3% matter so much?
Because of the margins in the first past-the-post constituencies. Let's say you have an SNP candidate who won their local seat with a majority of just 400 votes over the Labour candidate.
Which happened in several key battlegrounds.
Right. If the Merle scandal hits in April and just 500 loyal SNP voters in that specific town decide, I'm not voting unionist, but I am too disgusted to vote for the SNP, so I'm staying home, that 400-vote majority vanishes.
The 3 to 5% drop wipes out the marginal victories entirely.
Yes. The split opposition between Labour, Reform, and the Tories would no longer have been enough to save the SNP candidate. Those seats would have flipped by default.
Meaning the 73-seat artificial majority.
Shattered, completely obliterated. Without those marginal local constituency wins padding their numbers, the SNP's total seat count plummets.
So they would have lost the government.
The data suggests that a pre-election guilty plea would have sent the SNP into a definitive, incredibly weak minority position, likely falling well below 50 seats.
The precise timing of the judicial process prevented a total, historic electoral wipeout for the establishment.
It genuinely is staggering to think about. An entire national government survival hinged almost entirely on a court date.
But here's the thing. While almost 1 million more people actively voted against the government than for it, and while the core loyalist vote was shielded from the embezzlement reality, there is an even larger demographic in Scotland.
The ones who stayed home.
Exactly. A demographic that is often ignored, but who holds the ultimate power? We have to talk about the silent, angry majority. We have to talk about the 2 million missing voters.
This is the data point that should be keeping every single political leader in Holyrood awake at night, regardless of their party affiliation.
It's massive.
In the May 2026 election, a staggering 2,017,898 registered voters abstained. They did not cast a ballot. That is 46.7% of the entire eligible Scottish electorate.
Turnout crashed by 10.3 percentage points down to 53.2%.
Now, usually when voter turnout drops in an election, the political class and the Sunday morning panel shows roll out the exact same tired excuses.
They call it voter apathy. They say people are just lazy or it was raining.
Or the public just forgot there was an election. And our source materials strictly, empirically refute that condescending idea.
This wasn't just laziness.
Not at all. We have granular post-election data from independent researchers, specifically Ipsos and the Poverty Alliance, and their findings are chilling for the establishment.
They explain this massive drop in turnout as a deliberate, cynical strike against a broken political system.
In Scottish political terminology, they call it the scunner factor. People were utterly scunnered, sickened, exhausted, and fundamentally alienated by the political offerings across the board.
The Ipsos polling on this is incredibly revealing. When researchers went out and directly asked non-voters why they chose to stay home, 24%, nearly a quarter of the 2 million missing voters, cited a complete lack of trust in any political party or leader.
That is an active rejection of the system, not passive apathy. And the data from the Poverty Alliance adds a crucial, undeniable socioeconomic layer to this crisis.
Right, about deprivation.
Yes, they found that turnout was significantly, disproportionately lower in areas facing high levels of economic deprivation. We are talking about communities that have watched successive governments pass power back and forth for decades.
While their local economies stagnate and their public services crumble.
And their daily lives see absolutely zero material improvement. They feel entirely disenfranchised.
Let's look at a hypothetical profile, like a voter in a deprived area of Glasgow.
Sure. They voted yes to independence in 2014, hoping for radical change. They saw nothing change. They loaned their vote to Labour in 2024, hoping for competence.
And they got the Downing Street scandals and the Sarwar mutiny.
So in 2026, they looked at the ballot box and logically deduced that participating in the charade changes absolutely nothing about their reality.
So we need to calculate the true, brutal reality of the 2026 mandate. If we look at the entire eligible population of Scotland, every single registered voter who had the legal right to have their say. Here is the actual breakdown of the country's political will.
The real numbers?
Only 21.8% of the total eligible population actively voted for the SNP and Green alliance.
Think about that. Barely 1 in 5 eligible people actually endorsed the government.
Meanwhile, 31.5% actively went to the polls, specifically to vote against them. At a staggering 46.7%, refused to play the game at all.
When you frame the electorate in those true holistic terms, the 73-seat parliamentary majority looks fundamentally absurd.
It really does. You have a government claiming the absolute moral and legislative authority to reshape Scottish society, to increase taxes, to restructure healthcare, based entirely on the active consent of just 21.8% of the population.
It begs a massive philosophical question.
Yeah. When nearly half of the entire country looks at the ballot box and decides it's not worth the paper it's printed on, does the ballot paper itself lose its democratic authority?
It absolutely begins to lose its authority. A modern democracy functions entirely on a shared fiction. The collective belief that the ballot box is the ultimate, legitimate arbiter of power.
It works because the losers agree to abide by the results.
But when 46.7% of the population actively withdraws their participation, they are effectively withdrawing their consent to be governed by that specific system.
They're looking at the parliament and saying, your rules, your debates, and your laws no longer apply to my reality.
That is an incredibly dangerous, volatile threshold for any modern nation to cross.
And for the 53% who did decide to participate, that same underlying anger didn't just vanish. It manifested differently.
In a desperate search for alternatives.
Right, which led directly to the most shocking electoral breakthrough of the entire night. We have to examine the rise of Reform UK.
The massive surge of Reform UK in Scotland is the clearest, most undeniable indicator of the intense volatility currently ripping through the electorate.
They secured over 383,000 regional list votes.
That translates to an astonishing 16.6% of the total vote on the Peach ballot, granting them 17 seats in the Scottish Parliament.
To put that in perspective, they went from being a complete non-entity in Holyrood politics to being tied for the second largest party in the entire country. Where exactly did these nearly 400,000 voters come from?
Well, this wasn't just a sudden influx of traditional conservatives, not at all. Reform absorbed the profoundly disillusioned masses from across the political spectrum.
These were voters who felt betrayed on multiple fronts.
Yes, betrayed by the SNP's long domestic record, the failing educational standards, the severe NHS wait times. But crucially, a massive chunk of these voters were the very people who had tactically loaned their vote to Labour in 2024.
Only to be disgusted by the Starmer administration's immediate collapse into scandal.
Reform very successfully positioned themselves entirely outside the traditional left-right establishment axis. They didn't offer complex policy papers, they simply offered a highly visible vessel for pure, unfiltered, anti-establishment anger.
And how did the political establishment in Holyrood react to nearly 400,000 Scottish citizens voting for this new party? Let's critically evaluate First Minister John Swinney's official post-election stance.
Swinney's reaction was immediate, visceral, and uncompromising. He flatly refused to engage, cooperate, or even hold preliminary diplomatic talks with any of the newly elected Reform representatives.
He publicly labeled the entire party as far-right and explicitly branded them as extremists who had no legitimate place in the governance of Scotland.
Okay, let's pause and genuinely analyze the math behind that rhetoric, because John Swinney isn't just insulting 17 politicians in suits sitting across from him in the chamber.
By attacking reform in that specific manner, the First Minister is effectively branding nearly 400,000 ordinary Scottish voters, almost 1 in 6 of everyone who casts a list ballot, as illegitimate extremists.
If we connect this to the broader structural stability of the country, this is a fatal, catastrophic political miscalculation by the executive.
It represents the absolute arrogance of an establishment that fundamentally refuses to look in the mirror.
You cannot mathematically define 16.6% of your active voting public as a fringe extremist element. These are not political zealots. These are mainstream working-class voters.
These are nurses, electricians, office workers, delivery drivers.
Exactly. And when the leader of the country stands up on national television and dismisses a massive 400,000-strong bloc of the public as toxic extremists, it doesn't make those voters magically go away.
It doesn't convince them that their anger was misplaced.
It does the exact opposite. It entirely validates their anger. It provides ultimate confirmation of their deeply held belief that the political elite in Holyrood holds the working class public in absolute, unyielding contempt.
It tells them, we don't just disagree with your politics, we reject your fundamental right to participate in the democratic conversation. Which brings us to the climax of this entire analysis, the volatility warning.
The massive risk of direct action.
Because you cannot mathematically suppress the will of 2.7 million opposition voters, you cannot dismiss 400,000 reform voters as toxic extremists, and you cannot casually ignore 2 million missing non-voters without eventually breaking the very machinery of the state.
The core thesis we have arrived at through all this data across all these sources is this: stable democracy operates like a pressure valve.
It relies entirely on the shared societal belief that peaceful participation at the ballot box can affect meaningful change.
As long as the public believes the system works fairly, even if their chosen candidate loses an election, they accept the result, they vent their frustration, and they begin planning for the next election. The pressure is safely released.
But look at what the data tells us has happened to the Scottish pressure valve over the last 2 years. Every single mechanism for democratic release has been systematically sealed shut.
The electoral system itself, the AMS, was supposed to ensure proportionality. It completely failed, handing a massive artificial majority to an executive that mathematically lost the popular vote.
The judicial timeline acted as an impenetrable shield. It kept a massive corruption and grassroots embezzlement scandal entirely hidden from the public until after their votes were legally locked in.
Actively preventing the electorate from making a fully informed democratic choice.
And then, when the public does manage to force a new disruptive voice into the room, electing 17 reform MSPs specifically to channel their immense frustration, the leading politicians simply cross their arms, refuse to speak to them, and label their voters as extremists.
They jam the democratic valve shut from the inside.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most vital question of this entire deep dive. What happens to public political expression when the ballot box is demonstrably rendered useless?
It doesn't just evaporate. People don't just look at the math and say, oh, well, John Swinney won't listen to us and the Daunt method crushed our votes. I guess we'll just be quiet and pay our taxes for another 5 years.
No, they absolutely don't.
History is incredibly clear and unforgiving on this point. By alienating the alternative voting blocs, by explicitly dismissing 1 in 6 active voters as extremists, and by utterly ignoring the massive silent wall of 2 million scunnered non-voters, the political establishment is actively forcing public frustration out of the polling stations.
Our sources, particularly the sociological data analyzing the Scunner factor from the Poverty Alliance, explicitly warned of a highly volatile transition.
We are rapidly moving toward a period of unpredictable forms of public protest and direct action.
Because when the system explicitly tells the public that their votes don't matter, that their new representatives are illegitimate, and that their silence is just laziness, the public will eventually find a way to make themselves heard.
In a manner that the establishment cannot simply ignore or mathematically divide.
The transition from peaceful democratic participation to extra-parliamentary action, whether that means mass protests, strikes, civil disobedience, or worse, is the natural, inevitable consequence of a fractured, hollow mandate.
We have covered an immense amount of incredibly dense ground today.
We really have. Let's distill this journey. We've investigated an election that was ultimately decided by the collapse of a fractured tactical illusion from 2024.
We've seen a mathematically hollow executive mandate built on an 846,000 vote opposition deficit.
We've uncovered a devastating grassroots embezzlement scandal hidden behind a judicial shield until the ink on the ballots had dried.
And we've observed a political establishment entirely, almost willfully, disconnected from a silent, angry majority of 2 million citizens.
It is, by every metric available in the data, a perfect storm of systemic failure. So, circling back to you, the listener, for one final time, why should this matter to your daily life?
Because when a government operates, legislates, and taxes with the active affirmative consent of only 21.8% of the eligible population, the legitimacy of every single policy, every tax hike, and every law they pass is fundamentally compromised.
It affects the core stability of the society you live in. It dictates whether your government acts as a legitimate representative body or merely an occupying administration enforcing rules on a populace that has entirely rejected them.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Something to explore on your own that builds on the structural fragility we've discussed today.
What's that?
If the mathematical shock absorbers of the Scottish Parliament are fundamentally broken, and the ruling class refuses to recognize the democratic legitimacy of nearly 70% of the public, What happens when that 46.7% who stayed home decides that since their silence wasn't heard, their next step must be absolutely deafening?
Will the defining political movements of the late 2020s happen inside the pristine debated walls of Holyrood, or will they happen outside, in the volatile reality of the streets of Scotland?
It's a sobering thought.
It brings us right back to the beginning. We look at a modern election expecting the clean, binary precision of an X-ray. We expect a clear winner, a clear loser, and a clear mandate.
But the reality of May 2026 is that the X-ray machine is shattered.
The mandate is a complete mirage, and the diagnostic landscape is darker, more fractured, and significantly more volatile than anyone currently holding power wants to admit. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the numbers behind the narratives. We'll see you next time.